I'm Nick Zeppos, Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. Welcome to the Zeppos Report, a podcast where I talk with the people shaping and helping us understand our nation and our world.
Where'd you come up with the name?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I put the marketing people on it, and they put two things together. It's not a portmanteau, but it's clever. My guest today is, as you heard, author and visiting professor Jon Meacham. Jon is a renowned presidential historian, indeed American historian, and author of several books, including a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography on Andrew Jackson. He's also a contributing editor of Time and a contributing writer to the New York Times and the New York Times Book Review. He is joining me today to engage in a reflection about President Trump's first year in office and what it tells us about his place in American history. Jon, welcome to the Zeppos Report.
Thank you, Chancellor.
Well, you've written a number of things. You and I have talked quite a bit over soup and some good tuna salads. Let's start with just some general reactions to the president's first year. Is unorthodox the word, or do we have to nest him in some sort of historical context before we jump too far ahead to say there's never been like this before?
Well, one of my theories is just because something has happened before doesn't mean it's not happening again.
Yep.
So one peril, if you think the way I do, which is, Chester Arthur was, pretty bad too, is that's interesting but not dispositive. I think it is unprecedented in its unorthodoxy in tone and culture. I think when you really dig into what is substantively different in policy and in law from January 20th, 2017 until early 2018, it's a fairly orthodox Republican administration. I don't think another Republican actually would have ruled in substance much differently. Mm-hmm. And one of the things about Trump is it's damn near impossible to separate the style from the substance, because the style, frankly, is just so, for some, repellent, for others, refreshing, but undeniably fascinating and even entertaining. He's compulsively watchable. And so I don't think we know exactly yet how we're going to look at him, obviously. My own view is that his attempts to associate himself with Andrew Jackson are understandable, but not particularly convincing. I mean, 180 years it's hard to make that point in any event. To me, Director Mueller and the possibility of a Democratic House later this year are the two great questions. Yeah. My friend Gene Robinson, who's been here as part of your lecture series, Washington Post columnist, wonderfully said about Trump and Russia that it's as though you were pulled over by a cop for speeding and you say, "Okay, officer, of course, write me a ticket, but whatever you do, don't look in the trunk." And at every point, Trump says, "Don't look in the trunk," which at a certain point makes you think there's, Ivan is back there.
Yeah.
And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I think most things are explicable by essential human folly and coincidence and circumstance and all that. But I think the big story of this year is going to be what Mueller finds, and if what he finds is successfully undermined by Trump by arguing that it was the result of the deep state and the fake news and all that.
Yeah. Or that he would simply say, I can't govern with this sort of undermining of the office of the president. Nixon never had the chutzpah to really make the argument that I think the president will make, which is, and I think his lawyers hint at it, which is, I really can't obstruct because I got to get this out of the way to make America move forward. It's a distraction. And
Yeah.
I, as the president, and of course, Nixon he tried to get others, I guess, to do some bidding here
Yeah.
to say, well, this is hurting America, but yet that seems to also be the kind of thrust of the president's argument and kind of conflating his well-being and stature with what's good for America and kind of dismissing other institutions.
That's well put. Because he doesn't believe in and is not part of any institution that doesn't have his name on it.
Yeah.
If, as Emerson said, there's properly no history, only biography, and if that's the case, you have a man who made some amount of money, we don't know how much, turning himself into a brand.
Yeah.
So he's not a leader of the party. It is a cult of personality. There are people we know in common who bizarrely and rather sotto voce are fond of the fact that, or chiefly they're fond of the fact that he's not Hillary Clinton.
Right.
I mean, let's be clear. Presidential elections are not referendum, they're choices.
Right.
And I think if there'd been another Democrat, I think if Joe Biden had been the nominee, I think he would have won.
Yeah.
It's not a criticism of Secretary Clinton, it's just a clinical observation. So I get asked.
Let me kind of turn you to a related question then. The divisions we see in the country, do you think that he has strategically, opportunistically amplified them? Are they real ones? And you've written quite a bit about 1968 and other important years. How divided is the country? And do we have kind of the Heisenberg principle, which is we can't measure it because it's being influenced by his strategy? But how would you compare this to the Civil Rights era, the Vietnam War, and other things?
I think the difference is, between 1968 and today, so 50 years. 50 years ago, there was violence in the streets. There was 48 years ago, there was the shootings at Kent State. A remarkable number, maybe 47, something like that. Let's call it 50. About 50 U.S. servicemen were killed every day in 1968. Every day.
Yeah.
And Steve Bull, who used to work for Nixon, told Clara Bingham, a Vanderbilt parent and a mutual friend, that the Nixon White House, one of the reasons it spun out of control was they genuinely believed they were on the precipice of revolution. So we are missing that element now. I don't think that, to go directly to your question, I don't think there's a doubt in the world that he has exacerbated existing tribal differences for political gain.
Yeah.
And I've been very skeptical of we're so divided because of 1968, because in 1960, as Jack Kennedy said, after a wonderful profile was written of one of his aides when in the White House, they called the aide corsicatingly brilliant. Kennedy said another 60 votes in Cook County and we'd all be corsicatingly stupid. Joe McCarthy, in the 1930s, FDR said the two most dangerous men in America are Huey Long and Douglas MacArthur, because Long could lead a revolt from the left and MacArthur from the right. So it's a recurrent thing. But I do think that the media exacerbates it in the way the media exacerbated it in the 19th century. We are now, I think we have proven that the 20th century, in terms of the press, was the exception, not the rule. the rise of a seemingly neutral source of fact and data which could be fed into one's mind to create an opinion was a product of the progressive era and economics. Adolph Ox needed a position for the New York Times after 1896 when he bought it, and there were 40 other papers in New York that all had a political disposition, so he said, well, I'll just go up the middle. And that worked. It helped in broadcast because of the fairness doctrine. You know, we own the radio airwaves, we own the TV airwaves, and until 1986, that meant you had to at least feign neutrality, or if you express an opinion, you had to give the other side equal time. The repeal of that led directly to the rise of talk radio. Rush Limbaugh went national in '88. By '92, he's supporting Pat Buchanan in the challenge to George Bush, and that helped open the way for Ross Perot. And Perot was the first insurgent billionaire, and we've seen another one. So this is the culmination of a number of trends. And the question I don't know, I think universities have a role to play, actually, is how do you fix it?
Yeah. What, turning to the question of his brand and his name, I think we can kind of say there was a Bush dynasty. There still may be more of the dynasty that grows out of next generation, or even Jeb may return to politics in a way that we can't understand. Obviously, Bill Clinton and then Hillary Clinton, the Kennedys. Did Trump just demolish the notion that there were these established families and handovers of power so that we won't see that anymore? Or are we maybe going to see him try to develop a dynasty and other people saying, how do I leverage entertainment into dynastic family authority?
There were 9 presidential elections between 1980 and 2016. 7 out of those 9 tickets had either a Bush or a Clinton. I don't think there's any doubt that Trump's success in part is about, I think, a subconscious rebellion against an establishment embodied in many ways in those two families. This is not causal, but it is correlative. In those 36 years was the period where wages and household income began to stagnate and fall. So I hate this image almost as much as I hate Double Down, but it was a kind of perfect storm in 2016. Will it return? Whenever someone asks me to predict something, I say, well, let's just be clear. Donald Trump is president of the United States, so what the hell do any of us know? Yeah. Will this create as you say, an Oprah effect, where candidate recruitment becomes one of the elements of it? Is there a pre-existing fame that short circuits the ordinary channels of presidential politics? That's certainly possible. Will it create a backlash that opens the way for a very traditional senator or governor to be like Fortinbras, when Ivanka and Jared are stabbing each other on the stage and there's blood everywhere, and
I was thinking of Ben Kingsley in what's the movie where?
Oh, Dave.
Dave.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah,
with the spear.
And so I was thinking, well, maybe you just kind of bring out the person from boring central casting to kind of say, you know what, we really want to get somebody who plays a different role. We've seen that show. I think it's fascinating. You've referred to him as the first reality TV president. I mean, I think you can kind of see it every day. I think to move the news cycle, whether it's about Adam Schiff or it's treason because it's just there are no reruns. I mean, it's just a new kind of almost episode.
Nothing goes into syndication.
Yeah. And then he uses Twitter as provocative statements. Do you see this as changing the office of the president?
I think my sense is one thing is clear, and I'd put $5 on this. I think future presidents, in whatever form social media takes, will have to have an authentic presence on that platform. Mm-hmm. I do think that the tweets have created an apparent transparency, if you will. And I think if future presidents try to have the press office do it, people will know. That I do think has changed. Other things, too early to tell. It also depends on how this ends. If this ends in impeachment and conviction because he's been on the Russian payroll for 20 years, then there's a complete backlash.
Yeah.
If it ends in 7 years with a moderate uptick in household income and 3 conservative Supreme Court justices from the Federalist Society website, then the tools by which he governed will stay in the kit.
Yeah. I think one thing that people do miss is the notion that a politician, and it might have been true of Hillary Clinton, can all of a sudden seem like I'm into Twitter and I think you can't take the toolkit without having the person. It's like if I said, hey, John, you're going to play Hamlet. Now, you could probably do it. I couldn't. So you've got to have the person who actually can pull it off. And I think the mistake people are making is, well, this just shows the president's going to be run by, it's going to be all Twitter and it's going to be all this Instagram stuff. And it's like, well, you got to pull it off. I mean,
if the temperament's not.
Yeah, I mean, if it's like, it's kind of like, I don't know, Nixon wearing wingtips
on the beach.
I mean, it's just,
yeah.
If he'd had flip-flops on, maybe people would have said, where are the wingtips? I mean, you got to be authentic about the tools.
Well, to go to your point, which your example underscores your point, the reason he was on the beach was because all those great pictures of Kennedy on the beach.
Yep.
And he never got over Jack Kennedy. Yeah. And, Mrs. Obama had a marvelous line, and I'm sure it has antecedents in the conversation, though I don't know exactly where it would be, which is that the presidency doesn't change you, it magnifies who you are.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting filter with which to look at these folks. And it's certainly true of the post-war crowd. I've just been reading, I'm putting together a little anthology of, I was talking to David Lewis about it, called The Presidents on the Presidency. Just taking everything from their memoirs, everything from different conversations about what they themselves have said about the office. And because Truman had such a long post-presidency, he had a lot of time to talk.
Yeah.
And he said, and it's sort of scary in a way, the Merle Millers, everybody would ask him, what makes a great president? And how do we decide who's going to be a great president? And he says, well, you wouldn't have thought I was going to be one. And he said, you just don't know what a person is going to do until they get to a place of responsibility. Some people grow, some people don't. And there were those who thought, there'd be a Trump pivot, there'd be a growth, not true. I suspect this is not true in the university. I suspect it is true among administrators. But one of the things that I find fascinating about political office is you better have every bit of intellectual capital you can before you go into it, because it is so hard
Yeah.
to replenish. And the presidency is almost impossible. And so I think it does matter, and it is a legitimate line of inquiry. What do they know before they get in? Because it's just going to be a wild, harrowing ride all the way through. And Ronald Reagan's a good example here. A lot of people thought Reagan was, as he once put it, a combination of the Mad Bomber and Ebenezer Scrooge. But actually, his most interesting formative professional experience, besides Hollywood, had been being a union president
Right.
and cutting those deals all those years. And if we'd looked at him that way, we would have seen that it was not impossible to have what happened, which is to go from evil empire to literally playing with babies in Red Square.
Yeah.
He got the deal.
Yeah, and doing deals with Tip O'Neill.
Yeah. And
and
winning 49 states.
Yeah.
Can you imagine today a presidential election where we have 49 states agree on something?
Yeah.
It's like we're talking about the Punic Wars. I mean, it's just forever.
John, you wrote a recent piece in the Times where you said history suggests that the means of Trump's rise could be the means of his undoing. And then you make a reference to the McCarthy hearings. Could you just dive a little bit further into the connection and your thesis?
Yeah. Those who want to make a McCarthy-Trump connection, God sometimes gives you these things. It's not much of a leap because they had the same lawyer, Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn wrote an unusually honest memoir about McCarthy, published in '68, in which he's very blunt about the fact that McCarthy simply overstayed his welcome, that it was too intense for too long, and that the public has to tear down the characters they build up. That's just part of the nature of political life in a mass media age. And McCarthy really is the first example of this. And so my own view is that, and it's also the view of some of the former occupants of the office, is that he's too exhausting. And at some point, the public attention is filled up too far. FDR said that there's something, it was 1935, Ray Stannard Baker wrote him a letter saying, you got to get out more, talking more about basically the second New Deal in 35. And FDR wrote back saying that there's something in the public consciousness that resists hearing the highest note in the scale all the time. People get tired of seeing the same name in the headlines and hearing the same voice on the radio. Eisenhower said something remarkably similar, which was, I can't imagine anything more boring for people than to spend a half hour listening to me talk. They understood that there are moments like Agincourt where you have to be front and center, but Agincourts are the exception, not the rule. Trump does not understand that. And he told, the New York Times reported, one of the most interesting things of the last year journalistically was Maggie Haberman and Peter Baker reported that Trump, during the transition, told the White House staff that they should treat each day of the presidency as an episode in a TV show where he vanquishes his enemies. And this kind of, it's sort of Hobbes meets WWF. And I think that there is a limited capacity for the public to live with a war of all against all the time. I mean, I'm paid to pay attention to this, and I can't remember who he's attacking from hour to hour.
Yeah, and I think Americans do want problems solved, and at the end of the day, I think that's, if you're filling up so much of the time with things that are not solving the problems, when the problems really arise, that's where I think any politician is going to have risks.
It's a great starter. It's not a good finisher.
Yeah. Do you think he's, obviously Russia is very much on his mind, everyone's mind, but but has he really faced a crisis that has been kind of exogenously thrust at the nation,
Not yet.
that where he has to look everyone in the eye and say,
Not
we're
yet.
going to face this challenge together?
Not yet. The closest thing is North Korea. But no, he hasn't had a moment where, I think he hit Syria once. But no, there hasn't been that moment. And perhaps that, here we are with Lucy and the football, perhaps that changes things. I tend to think not. George W. Bush really became president, whatever you feel about how he widened the war beyond Afghanistan 2 years later, when he was standing down at Ground Zero.
Yeah.
And it's a fascinating clip to watch because he's losing the crowd. Yeah. They're heckling him a little bit. Yeah. We can't hear you. Yeah. And then he says, we can hear you, the great bullhorn moment. Yeah. So you do need crisis.
Yeah, it's one thing. I mean, I think one of the most remarkable moments is when you see him reading books to children.
Yeah.
And, that's very presidential. It's a great photo opportunity. You're leading with a tone, but yet you're not feeling the weight of the world on your shoulders.
Right.
And then to take that into, okay, now this is what has happened in America, this largest attack since Pearl Harbor.
Yep.
That can really season you, or you have to meet that challenge as president. And you don't think he's had that moment?
No. And if you go to Walter Bagehot, right? So Bagehot laid out the two elements of government, constitutional government, dignified and efficient.
Yeah.
He's failed the dignified. The efficient hasn't been as bad as people expected.
Yeah.
It just hasn't. You can disagree about Justice Gorsuch, you can disagree with the tax bill, and should, but a President Cruz, a President Rubio, a President Walker would have done exactly the same thing.
Yeah. Well, let me push you a little bit on the efficiency side by bringing in checks and balances.
Yeah.
And do you see the other branches as meeting some sort of constitutional responsibility that's, in some way true north, in some way, if it can be apolitical, to say we are going to check and balance? Is that playing out in our system?
I think the courts are. I think that at least the Ninth Circuit is, as ever. But the courts on the immigration order, on things where he was about to drive us off the road, I think the courts have stepped in. Congress is trickier because the problem is they actually agree with them, the Republican majorities. And you and I both know senators in particular who we know, and they will say privately that this guy is a loose cannon and it's dangerous, but the nature of the Republican voter right now is such that what experience has taught us in 2017 has been you stand up to this guy either when you've left, whether when you've decided not to run for re-election or you've been diagnosed with a fatal illness, like Corker McCain.
Yeah.
You would hope that there would be those who would see the portrait of Daniel Webster and at least think about, when they update profiles in Courage, am I going to be a candidate? Which reminds me of what my friend Michael Beschlaw says.
It's only one volume.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
why it's only one
Right.
volume.
Right.
What about, I know you're an historian, but you're also a decent prognosticator. Is it too early to talk about the midterms, John? I mean, is it...
They need 22. The Democrats need 22 seats in the House. Let's say, I think the historical average is they lose the incumbent party. The incumbent presidential party tends to lose 30 to 33 seats in the first midterm. if that holds true, it seems to me it becomes a Democratic House. Really interesting question. Does it become Speaker Pelosi, or is there a generational shift? But that's putting the cart before the horse, or the Prius before the
Leaf.
I would be surprised if the House doesn't flip, and I wouldn't be stunned to see the Senate flip.
Wow.
I think there's a
Bold.
great race here.
Yep.
I mean, Bredesen versus Blackburn is a canary in the mine shaft,
Yeah.
and Marsha Blackburn has been an early and vocal Trumpite. Phil Bredesen, former Democratic governor, it's not the jazziest public figure, but I think what he's going to bet on is we have plenty of jazz, and it's a time for serious people.
Yeah. I thought of course, I'm a law professor, and look at the court's keenly. I thought the Supreme Court's decision to just stay out of the Pennsylvania thing was really I'm sure it was driven by concepts of law and principle, but I also think it was a marvelous political move to basically just say, you know what, in the technical phrase, maybe there are adequate and independent state grounds. We don't decide state law questions. And it was close enough to say, why don't we just not eat that red meat right now?
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting. Now, I think Linda Greenhouse she's writing about the chief. I don't know if it's a hopeful Linda. I mean, I really respect her.
Roberts is an interesting guy.
Yeah, I think she's onto something about, when you leave the bench or you leave the job, what do you say? We won a bunch of 5-4s, and it's one thing to say, I won 300 baseball games, and there were a bunch of 2-1 where I outpitched the other side. You can be a Sandy Koufax, but presiding over a divided court and making the institutional choices that could be driven by his principles, but yet he's afraid of the conjoining of the branches. It'll be an interesting, he may become very parsimonious in what he decides.
Interesting man. We knew it would be an interesting ride because he was so young when he got it. You could begin to see that he was thinking about the oil portrait with the Affordable Care Act decision.
Yeah.
And I think one of the brilliant features of the system as it's evolved is, they're sitting up there and they have the ability, particularly now that we appoint them so young, to spend 30 years and think about what they want the legacy to be.
Yeah, well, for all I know, they just reversed the Pennsylvania court, so it shows what I know. Jon, thank you for joining me today and engaging in this lively discussion about the current state of our nation's highest office within an historical context. It's an honor to have you here at Vanderbilt. Let me do a little bit of advertising. You can download this and other episodes of the Zeppos Report at vu.edu/Zeppos-report. That's vu.edu/Zeppos-report. I know many of you hang, as I do, on every word that Professor Meacham utters, and so please tune into this one. Thank you so much, Jon.
Thank you, Conch Laurier.